All right, buckle up, everyone, because in this deep dive, we're going to be exploring, well, the frontiers of reality and perception.
Ooh, sounds intense.
Yeah, it kind of is. We're tackling some really thought-provoking ideas from Donald Hoffman, specifically his in-phase theory of perception.
ITP?
Yeah, ITP, and also this concept of conscious realism.
Which those of you who've been following Hoffman's work know that it's pretty out there.
It's definitely mind-bending stuff. You might be joining us for this deep dive
Yeah.
because you're fascinated by just, what is reality? Or maybe you have to, have a philosophy discussion coming up.
Or maybe you just you love a good like brain twist.
Exactly. And to do this, we're working with some excerpts from a couple of his academic papers, Conscious Realism and the Mind-Body Problem, and Objects of Consciousness.
And let me tell you, these papers are dense. They are packed with some seriously complex concepts.
Yeah, so we're here to kind of distill it all down.
Make it a little more palatable.
Right. So let's start with something I think we all experience every day, which is perception.
That's a good place to start.
Yeah. So we all tend to assume that what we see and hear and touch, that's the actual world, right?
Right.
But what if I told you that might not be, actually true?
That's where Hoffman throws us for a loop with this interface theory of perception. That's the ITP, and he uses this analogy of a computer desktop.
Oh.
And so, think about it. All those little icons on your screen, they're useful, right?
Yeah.
They let us interact with our computer.
They don't look anything like the actual file?
No, they're representations.
Yeah.
They're like a simplified version.
Okay, I'm seeing where you're going with this.
Yeah.
So we're the users, and our perceptions, all of our senses are like that interface, and it's, tailored for, a purpose, right?
Yeah, exactly. Hoffman argues that our perceptions, they evolved for fitness.
So, survival.
Survival, reproduction, all that, but not for giving us a perfect picture of the universe.
So, they're not there to show us what reality truly is.
Exactly.
Okay. So it's more like, instead of seeing all the complexity of, let's say a wall, we just perceive, solid object, don't walk through it.
Right, which is very useful.
Very helpful, very useful for avoiding injuries, but, maybe not, the most accurate depiction.
Right. It's all about guiding our actions, not revealing the universe's, deepest secrets and all that.
Okay, but hold on. Wouldn't evolution, favor perceptions that are more truthful? I mean, wouldn't that give us, an advantage?
It seems like it would, right? The more accurate your perception, the better.
Yeah.
But Hoffman points out that, natural selection, it doesn't actually care about truth.
Right.
It only cares about what gets you more offspring.
Okay.
And there have been studies using these things called evolutionary games and genetic algorithms. Basically, they simulate evolution in a computer. And what they found is that those perceptions that are tailored for fitness, for survival and reproduction, they often outcompete those that are more focused on, pure accuracy.
Interesting. So, our ancestors who could quickly spot, a predator or a potential mate, even if, their perception wasn't perfect, they were more likely to, pass on their genes, right?
Yeah, exactly. A simple action-oriented perception, even if it wasn't, totally accurate, was better than, a slow and super accurate one, even if that one, reflected the world more faithfully.
Okay. So this is getting really interesting because now, if our perceptions aren't really designed to show us the truth, then, what does that even mean for how we understand reality?
It's a big question, and a lot of people, they have trouble with this idea. Is there even, such a thing as objective truth if our perceptions are so subjective?
Right. And this next part, it really kind of throws everything we think we know, out the window.
Mm-hmm.
We all learned about this thing called object permanence, right? It's the idea that, things exist even when we're not looking at them.
Right, like peekaboo.
Yeah, basic stuff. But Hoffman actually challenges that whole concept.
Yeah, he says that objects as we perceive them, with our senses, might not have an independent existence.
So, they might not be there when we're not looking.
It's almost like they're more like icons on a desktop. Like when you close the window, poof, the icon's gone.
Yeah.
And this is where we really kind of leave the familiar world, everyday experience, and enter this realm of what Hoffman calls conscious realism.
Okay, this is a lot. So if, objects aren't the foundation of reality, what is?
Well, Hoffman proposes that the fundamental building blocks of the universe are not objects, but conscious agents.
Okay, wait, hold on. So does that mean, like, my coffee mug is, like, suddenly, like, having, like, an existential
No,
crisis?
no, no, no. We're not talking about like panpsychism here.
Okay, good.
Um, in Hoffman's framework, these conscious agents, they're entities that are capable of perception, decision, and action.
Okay.
And importantly, they can be represented mathematically.
Oh, okay.
And these agents, they can combine to form like more complex agents. And this leads to like the emergence of new properties and new behaviors.
So instead of the universe built from, like, tiny particles, we have a universe built from, like, these conscious agents that are, like, interacting with each other.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild idea.
It is. But then, like, how does that explain the physical world, like, all the stuff we experience?
Well, that's where things get really, really mind-bending.
Okay, I'm ready.
Hoffman suggests that particles, like the fundamental building blocks of matter, as we understand it right now, might actually be representations of the asymptotic behavior of interacting conscious agents.
Asymptotic behavior.
Yeah.
I'm gonna need you to, like, break that down a little bit.
Yeah, sorry.
Uh,
Essentially, it refers to like the long-term patterns that emerge in a system over time.
okay.
So Hoffman argues that these long-term patterns of interaction between the conscious agents, and these patterns can be described mathematically using like concepts like Markov chains.
Okay.
And these patterns, they can be mapped onto the behavior of particles, like the particles we observe in, quantum physics and stuff.
So the particles that we see, they're not actually, like, fundamental things. They're more like emergent properties.
Yeah, arising from this like complex interplay of all these conscious agents.
Oh, okay. And what about space-time then?
Well, even space-time itself might just be the framework upon which we represent all these interactions, like kind of the canvas on which the symphony of consciousness is playing out.
Is wow. Okay.
Pretty wild, right?
Yeah. So this is, like, totally challenging the traditional view of, like, the mind-body problem.
Oh, absolutely.
Which is, like, this question of how does consciousness even arise from matter?
Right. And Hoffman just flips the whole script. He says instead of asking how matter creates mind, maybe consciousness is like the fundamental thing.
Right.
And matter is like derivative.
Like the other way around.
Yeah, so our brains, they don't create consciousness.
Yeah.
They're just complex icons within our perceptual interface, kind of like tools that we use to, interact with this underlying reality of conscious agents.
And my brain is just a fancy icon on a cosmic desktop.
Kind of, yeah.
It's a very powerful image, but, like, if that's the case, how do we explain things like free will?
Right.
And
Yeah.
if, like, our perceptions are so unreliable, how can we even trust science to, uncover the truth?
Those are great questions. And, Hoffman, he addresses those concerns head on in his work.
Okay.
So, for example, he argues that free will, it might arise from the probabilistic nature of interactions between the conscious agents.
So, like, our choices aren't, like, predetermined,
Right.
but they, like, influence the probabilities.
Yeah, yeah. So our choices as conscious agents ourselves, we become like part of this dynamic interplay. And that influences the overall flow of information and the probabilities of, different events occurring.
So even though we're operating within this, like, perceptual interface, our choices still matter.
That's the
Yeah, they have real consequence.
Yeah. It's we're not just, passively watching. We're actually active participants in shaping reality through our decisions and actions.
Okay. What about science then? How can we trust science if everything is, like, so subjective?
Well, that's another really common concern. But Hoffman actually argues the opposite.
Really?
Yeah. He says that his theory, it actually strengthens the scientific method.
Okay.
So think about it.
Yeah.
Science has always been about creating models and testing them against, observations.
Right.
The interface theory of perception, it adds another layer to that process.
Yeah.
It reminds us that our observations are always filtered through our perceptual interface. And we need to be like mindful of those limitations when we're interpreting scientific data.
So it's almost like realizing that the Earth isn't flat.
Yeah, exactly.
Even though, like, from our limited perspective, it looks that way, right? And that realization, it led to, like, a much more accurate understanding of the universe. So recognizing the limitations of, like, our interface could lead to even deeper, like, scientific insight.
Absolutely. So instead of, throwing out science, we need to be, more more sophisticated in how we interpret scientific findings.
Be more aware of the biases, the limitations.
Exactly. And this leads to another really fascinating aspect of Hoffman's work, which is the implications for evolution.
Oh, okay.
So traditionally, evolution is seen as this kind of blind, random process.
Right, just random variation and natural selection.
Right. But if, conscious agents are the fundamental building blocks of reality, that changes everything.
Oh, wow. So it's not just about organisms competing for resources in a pre-existing environment. It's about, like, these conscious agents interacting.
Yeah, and in a way they're shaping the very fabric of reality through those interactions.
So instead of, like, a blind, purposeless process,
Yeah.
evolution might be driven by, like, the interactions and choices of these conscious agents.
That's the idea. It's almost like evolution itself is a form of like conscious creation.
Okay, that's pretty mind-blowing. It suggests, like, a level of, like, purpose and directionality in evolution that we haven't really considered before.
Right, and it opens up a whole new set of questions about, the nature of life, consciousness, and the universe itself.
I mean, we've covered a lot of ground here, but I have to admit, I'm still struggling with this idea of these conscious agents.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big one.
It is. Like, what are they exactly, and how do they, like, interact to create, like, the reality that we experience?
Yeah, those are the million-dollar questions, and they lead us into some of the more challenging and speculative aspects of Hoffman's work.
Okay. Well, then I guess we better keep going.
Yeah, let's dive in. Welcome back to our exploration of Donald Hoffman's pretty radical ideas about reality and perception.
I'm still trying to, like, wrap my head around this idea that, what we see, what we experience, it might not be the whole picture.
Yeah, it's a big one to swallow.
It is. It's like, our perceptions are more like a tailored user interface,
Yeah.
like on a computer or something, than like an actual window to the real nature of things.
It is a pretty big shift in how we think about the world and our place in it.
Yeah, it really is. And one of the things that I found, like, really compelling, one of the arguments that Hoffman makes is about color perception.
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
it turns out that our vision is super limited.
Oh, incredibly so.
Yeah. We can only see this tiny sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum.
It's crazy how much we miss out on.
It is. And even the colors that we do see, they're not necessarily accurate reflections of, like, the wavelengths of light
Right,
that are
right.
hitting our retinas.
Yeah, it's more like our eyes they're presenting us with this simplified version of reality, and
Right.
and they're highlighting certain aspects, but totally ignoring others.
So it's like tailored for us in a way.
Exactly. And Hoffman, he argues that this isn't like a flaw. It's actually a feature.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's a system that's been highly optimized over, millions of years of evolution
Right.
to highlight the information that's most, relevant for our survival, for, passing on our genes.
So, like, being able to, quickly tell the difference between, like, a ripe fruit and an unripe one.
Right. Or a dangerous predator from a, harmless animal.
Right, exactly. Those things they're more important in a way than perceiving, like, the full spectrum of color.
Precisely. And this principle, this idea that it's not about truthful perception, it's about efficient perception. That
Yes.
that applies to all of our senses, not just vision.
Okay. So if our senses are giving us this, like, streamlined view of reality, then, what does it even mean for how we understand the world? Like, do we even have a grasp on what's really out there?
Yeah, that's the really big question.
Right,
Is
yeah.
and it's one that, philosophers have been wrestling with for centuries.
Right.
But, if we accept this idea that our senses are more like a user interface,
Okay.
then we have to ask, what is that underlying reality that this interface is representing?
Right. And that's where, I guess, Hoffman's concept of conscious realism comes in, right?
Exactly. He's proposing that reality is not made up of, physical objects in space-time as we perceive them, but rather it's made up of these conscious agents, these entities that are capable of perception, decision, and action.
Okay, wait. So are we back to, like, my coffee mug being, like, sentient?
No, not quite. These conscious agents, they might be much, much simpler than what we typically think of, as minds or selves. They might be
Yes.
like these really, really fundamental units of of consciousness that interact in ways that we don't fully understand yet.
Okay, so these conscious agents are like the building blocks of reality.
In a way,
But then
yeah.
how do they give rise to like the physical world, like all the stuff that
Right.
we experience, you know?
Right. And that's one of the biggest, challenges for Hoffman's theory.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And he's exploring like all sorts of really fascinating possibilities. One idea is that the particles that we observe in physics,
Right.
they might actually be representations of the long-term patterns of interaction between these conscious agents.
Okay, so instead of particles being like these fundamental building blocks, they're more like emergent properties that come about from the complex interplay of
Yeah.
these conscious agents.
Exactly. Yeah. It's kind of like think about like a flock of birds.
Okay.
You've got all these individual birds and they're all flying around, seemingly randomly.
Yeah.
But then you look at the flock as a whole,
Right.
and there's these patterns, these emergent patterns that arise from the interactions of all those individual birds.
Okay.
So in this analogy, like the individual bird, they're like the conscious agents,
Yeah.
and the flock's movement, that's like the emergent property, the particle-like behavior that we observe.
Okay. I think I'm starting to see how this could work. But then how does Hoffman explain like the laws of physics if particles aren't really fundamental?
Right. Well, he suggests that the laws of physics might be like a reflection of the rules that govern the interactions between these conscious agents.
Oh, okay.
So in a sense, like the laws of physics are kind of like the operating system of this conscious reality.
Right.
You know, the framework within which these agents are interacting and doing their thing.
So the laws of physics might be more like guidelines or habits, that emerge from the collective behavior of these agents.
Yeah, exactly. And that opens up this really interesting possibility that maybe the laws of physics are more malleable than we currently believe.
Right.
Or that they might be context dependent.
Hmm.
They might change depending on the context of the interactions.
It's definitely a very different way of looking at things.
It is. And Hoffman's work, it opens up some really intriguing avenues for research, both in, physics and in consciousness studies.
Yeah. This whole idea, it has me thinking about, all these other things. Like if what we see isn't necessarily true, then what about free will?
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. Like are we just clicking on pre-programmed icons, so to speak?
Right. And that's a really important question. And Hoffman, he addresses that concern directly.
Okay.
He proposes that free will, it might arise from the probabilistic nature of interactions between conscious agents.
Okay, so remind me, what does that mean? Probabilistic.
Yeah, so it means that like our choices, they're not predetermined,
Oh.
but they influence the probabilities of different outcomes.
Oh,
So imagine, you've got all these conscious agents and they're constantly exchanging information and they're making decisions based on that information.
Right.
And then our choices, as conscious agents ourselves,
Yeah.
they become part of this dynamic interplay,
Right.
and they influence the overall flow of information and the probabilities of different things happening.
So even though we're operating within this perceptual interface,
Mhm.
our choices still have like real consequences.
Yeah, that's the idea. We're not just passive observers. We're
Yeah.
actually active participants in shaping reality through our decisions and actions.
That's empowering.
It is.
Okay. But then, that leads to another question that I've been kind of wrestling with, which is if our perceptions are so unreliable, how can we trust science?
Right.
How can we trust science to uncover the truth about reality?
Right. That's another big one. And it seems like this theory, it could undermine the whole scientific enterprise, right?
He does, kind of.
But Hoffman, he argues the opposite.
Really?
He says that his theory actually strengthens the scientific method.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How does it do that?
Well, because, think about it. Science has always been about creating models.
Right.
And testing those models against observations. And the interface theory of perception, it adds another layer to this process.
Mm-hmm.
It reminds us that our observations are always filtered through our perceptual interface.
Okay.
And we need to be mindful of those limitations when we're interpreting scientific data.
So it's almost like realizing that the Earth isn't flat.
Exactly.
even though it appears that way from our limited perspective, right?
Right, right.
And that realization, it led to, a much more accurate understanding of the universe. So maybe recognizing the limitations of our perceptual interface,
Mm.
that could lead to even, deeper scientific insights.
Absolutely. So instead of throwing out science, what we need to do is we need to be more sophisticated in how we interpret scientific findings.
Okay.
Always keeping in mind the potential biases and limitations of our perceptual interface.
That makes sense.
And this leads to another really fascinating aspect of Hoffman's work, which is the implications for evolution. So, the traditional view of evolution, it sees it as this blind, this random process of variation and natural selection.
Right.
But if conscious agents are the fundamental building blocks of reality, then that changes everything.
Oh, wow. Okay, so it's not just about, like organisms competing for resources in a pre-existing environment.
Uh-huh.
It's about like these conscious agents interacting and like shaping the very fabric of reality through those interactions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's almost like evolution itself is a form of conscious creation.
Okay. That's pretty mind-blowing. It suggests like a level of purpose and directionality in evolution that we haven't really considered before.
Yeah, and it opens up a whole new set of questions about, the nature of life, consciousness, the universe itself.
Yeah. It kind of makes you wonder, like, what is the role of consciousness in all of this?
Exactly. And that's something that we'll explore more in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, looking forward to it. All right, so welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into, Donald Hoffman's work.
It's been a wild ride.
It has, and I'm still, grappling with this idea of conscious agents as like the fundamental building blocks of reality.
Yeah. It's a lot to take in.
It is. Last time we kind of left off with this question of like, what are they exactly?
Right, right.
Like they're not, little people running around creating the universe, are they?
Oh, no, it's I think a better way to think about it is that Hoffman he defines them mathematically.
Yeah.
Like he describes them as entities that have these specific properties
Yeah.
related to perception, decision, and action.
Okay, so like, what does that even mean?
Well, think of it this way. Conscious agents, they're like the simplest units of experience. Like
Okay.
they can receive information,
Okay.
they can process it, and then they can act upon it.
Okay.
And by doing that, they influence the world around them.
So they're not necessarily like minds as we think of them,
Right, or selves or anything like that.
but more like the fundamental ingredients of experience.
Exactly. Yeah. And Hoffman suggests that these conscious agents they can combine
Okay.
and they can interact to form more complex systems,
Well,
kind of like atoms combining to form molecules.
Oh, okay. So are you saying that like our consciousness, like my sense of self,
Yeah.
it's like a complex molecule made up of these simpler conscious agents?
That's a good way to visualize it. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I think I'm starting to get it. But how do these, conscious agents actually create the physical world?
Yeah.
Like with all the, laws of physics and seemingly solid objects and all that.
Right, right. Well, that's where things get really, really interesting. Hoffman suggests that the physical world as we perceive it,
Yeah.
it might be like a kind of projection or a representation of the interactions of these conscious agents.
Okay. I'm listening.
Like think like a shadow play.
Oh.
You've got the shadows on the screen.
Right.
And those shadows, they're not the actual objects, right?
Right.
They're just representations of those objects cast by, the light source.
Okay. Yeah, I get that. So are you saying the physical world is like a shadow play?
In a way, yeah.
And the conscious agents are like the objects casting the shadows?
Yeah, something like that.
Okay. But then what's like the light source
Uh,
in this analogy?
right. Well, that's a really, really good question. And it's one that Hoffman is still exploring.
Yeah.
And it gets into some very, very complex territory involving like quantum mechanics and information theory and all that.
Right.
But one possibility is that the light source, so to speak, might be something like a fundamental field of consciousness
Okay.
that permeates the entire universe.
Yeah.
And the interactions of these conscious agents within that field, they're what create the patterns that we perceive as the physical world.
Oh, wow. So the physical world, it might not actually be made of like matter and energy as we understand it, but rather of patterns of information
Right.
that come about from the interactions of these conscious agents.
Yeah, that's the basic idea.
I mean, that's huge. That has like implications for everything.
Like really
Like
does.
how we understand like the universe,
Yeah.
our place in it, the laws of physics, like everything.
Exactly. And for example, like, the laws of physics, they might not be fundamental and unchanging,
Okay.
but rather they might be emergent properties of these interactions between the conscious agents.
So the laws of physics are more like guidelines
Yeah, or
or
habit.
habits that emerge from the collective behavior of these agents.
Right, rather than like absolute unbreakable rules.
And that opens up the possibility that like maybe the laws of physics can change or they're context dependent.
Right, exactly.
Okay. I mean, this is all very intriguing, but I have to admit it's really a lot to wrap my head around.
It
Like
is.
we're venturing into some pretty speculative territory here, aren't we?
We are. And to be fair, Hoffman's theory, it's still in its early stages of development. There's
Yeah.
a lot more research that needs to be done,
Yeah.
exploration.
Right.
But even if some of the details turn out to be, not quite right,
Okay.
I think his work offers a really valuable framework for thinking about the nature of reality and consciousness in a new and potentially revolutionary way.
I agree with that. It's
Yeah.
definitely challenging a lot of my assumptions about, the world and my place in it.
Right,
And
yeah.
and it's making me question, what does it mean to be human, to be conscious,
Right.
to exist in this vast and mysterious universe.
I think that's the power of truly groundbreaking ideas, They
Mhm.
shake us out of our complacency. They force us to re-examine our beliefs, and they open our minds to new possibilities.
And who knows, maybe this, exploration of conscious agents
Yeah.
and their role in shaping reality,
Yeah.
maybe it'll lead us to a deeper understanding of ourselves and the universe.
I hope so.
I mean, I'm definitely going to be thinking about these ideas for a long time to come.
Me too.
Thank you so much for taking us on this fascinating journey, into the depths of consciousness and reality.
It's been my pleasure, and thank you to all of our listeners for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah.
We hope it's sparked your curiosity and inspired you to explore these questions further on your own.
Absolutely.